We have a thumbnail of yourself along the side. Okay, quick time check.
Okay.
So we have 4 seconds. All right, schedules being as tight as they are. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the government track sessions this morning. Our sponsors are Microsoft and Systran. Thank you to our sponsors. Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer DeCamp. Jennifer is going to talk about history, and it's a U.S.-centric history, but I think it's very valid especially for this government track group right here. And Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to complete your introduction and take it from here, please.
Well, thank you, Steve. I've been interested in the history of machine translation for a long time. In fact, I was originally interested in the history of technology and science fiction, which often, steers into the area of translation. So anyway, a few years ago, I was contacted by Routledge Publishing to do an article with Jost Zetzky on the history of machine translation in the United States. And originally, like Steve, I was kind of concerned that, how on earth do you talk about machine translation from the viewpoint of one country, because it's so interwoven. But actually, it turned out really quite well, because other people were taking perspectives from other countries, and the whole combination of perspectives really made a good whole, and it brought to light a number of different things that had been there had not been room for in earlier versions of histories. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the history of MT, because I think there's a lot that AMTA and our community can do in this area. Our history is a precious thing. It is our community. It is our path to the future. So it is something we need to preserve, and it's something that we need to document. And I think there is so much that we can do with it. And I also just think it is a great story. I mean, starting with the Imitation Game, and in fact, even before that, and rolling in Star Wars, and good old R2-D2. It is a rich history. So the history of MT really starts with John Hutchins. Well, no, it doesn't start with John Hutchins, but John Hutchins made an enormous contribution to it. John was not a computational linguist. He was not really a linguist, although he studied foreign languages. He was a librarian, and his whole discipline and his work was in librarianship. And he brought a level of detail and academic rigor to the documentation of machine translation that is just way beyond what most disciplines are able to have. So I think everybody here, and probably many other people, started out with machine translation with either Machine Translation Past, Present, and Future by John Hutchins, or the book that he co-authored with Harold Summers on an introduction to machine translation. And these books set our concept of machine translation and our terminology. And they created a common set of concepts and a common experience of reading. I loved those books. Actually, I liked Early Years in Machine Translation even better. Now, John's bibliography goes multiple pages. I just picked a few things out. Plus, he gave us the MT Compendium of translation software that is on the EAMT website. And when he passed away last year, he donated his materials to EAMT and IAMT, which of course includes us, in an archive, which is also on the EAMT site. But the thing is, no matter how wonderful this is, and it truly is a wonderful collection, there are constraints. There are constraints because of space, because people were dealing with paper copy as opposed to internet, and there were there were constraints due to certainly due to access to information, such as the government. I want to point out that there have been many historians, that everyone who's taught an intro to MT course at one of our conferences, everyone who's taught the same type of course in a university has been dealing with history. And I won't read the names, but you can read those. There are many other kinds of histories out there. I love what Wikipedia has done with the timeline of machine translation. I don't agree with it all, but it is a public set of information that can be viewed by anybody. People can comment on it, people can add to it. And I think that is exactly what Wikipedia was set up to do, and it's a great resource. Taos also has an extensive history of MT, but it's behind their paywall. But there's an interesting thing that's occurred, that Taos and some companies like IBM and Systran have put out public histories of MT which just concern themselves. Like Taos is just about Taos, and the IBM and Systran are just about IBM and Systran. And that's an interesting development because they are then responsible for making sure that their own histories are correct and complete and updated. I love it. There's also a very short history on the AMTA site, which I think we can expand. Now, there are a lot of other resources out there. There's this resource of Routledge, which I was describing. And one of the other nice things about Routledge is that there are not only many articles, but there are many actual encyclopedias. Like there's a Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies. And one of the fascinating things is looking at how translation studies evolved relative to the translation technology, and often the translation technology coming first. There, of course, are presentations in the ACL archives. There's some review here. And another thing that is interesting is just that there's no longer this space consideration. When I did the 2014 article, we were constrained to 20 pages. We've now been told run free because there'll be a web version and people are happy to have as much material as folks would like to have out there. So that's a moving to the web is a major achievement here in the history. Next slide, please. Well, I've talked about constrained a lot, so I thought I'd take an example from Xerox. And I was the Xerox multilingual program manager back in the 80s and early 90s, actually 80s and 90s in Xerox. And so I was there. And so what I did is I took the literature, and for this example, I'm just using the Introduction to Machine Translation because the same ideas are repeated in other Hutchins works. But I think all of you know the story that Xerox installed Systran in 1982 for technical manuals using a customized English that had 3,000 words and rules for unambiguous English. And they used a controlled vocabulary and syntax and a pre-translation editor. So, of course, I look at this and I go, yes, but more. They did mention that they used used a highlighting so that all types of errors were highlighted in the pre-version, the pre-translation version, such as, well, they weren't exactly errors, but for instance, run-on sentences, lack of use of punctuation, not found words, etc. But also there was a version where Xerox, working with the Palo Alto Research Center, which was under Xerox at that time, they had the highlighting transferred to the output so that there was a confidence measure that alerted post editors as to what types of things they should look at because of the source text. And this was in the 1980s. Hutchins and Summers also write that the texts that their writers, Xerox writers, produce are clearer and more understandable. But cause. In other words, I like text. I like the second and third sentences in a history, not just the top level. But the key thing is the texts were more consistent in terminology. And that is a lesson that we are still, there still are articles out about the importance of consistent terminology and ways to get consistent terminology.
Hello, Jennifer. Excuse me, just need to let you know 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll speed up here. I get kind of excited about this topic. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you go back one? Oh, I'm sorry. I need to go back one. Okay. So anyway, one of the biggest things, though, that was a gap is that in the late 80s, we took a small semi-portable mainframe that IBM came out with and put Systran and this smart system from Xerox and also Metal. So we had multiple MT engines. And we had this post-editing and pre-editing, post-editing, confidence measures, all of this. And we put it together in a solution that was called DocuTrans, although the name DocuTrans was co-opted by somebody else later on. And we took that to ATA conferences, and it was a little before AMTA. And we took it around the government and showed it to a lot of folks. We actually sold about a dozen of them. So I think that DocuTrans had an effect on some of the customer requirements that came out that in turn had an effect on the development of MT in the United States. But it fell between the cracks or fell between the books, if you like, and was not included in the histories. There's certain areas I noticed that really are gaps. There's certain times which sort of correspond to the retirements of key people. There are gaps in the government, and you may think we have an abundance of government things because we've been fortunate enough to have presentations by DARPA, IARPA, WritePat, Library of Congress, MIFLETS, and a few others. But there's always been a lot of constraints about what they could talk about and about a lot of really cool other projects that just never got in. And I was showing a copy of this. Oops, I'm sorry. My screen is moving relentlessly forward. So anyway, what we're trying to do is to fill these gaps. And one of the questions is why? And I think there's a lot we can learn from this. Their best practices, requirements, motivations. There are a lot of trends. There's an opportunity to actually look at the flow of our history and see, what did we predict right? What did we predict wrong? How could we do prediction better? And we'd really like to do that by addressing the underrepresented areas, by planning some AMTA panels on US government work in MT, where we can get more documented detail and where we can obtain official government disclosures and maybe even push the bar on what can be disclosed. I mean, ever since the Imitation Game, governments all over have been coming forward with all kinds of material. So I think we can also do some things at IAMT and maybe focusing on specific issues, and that we can work that no one person can document so complex a field, but I think that AMTA can really play a central role along with EAMT and IAMT in encouraging the expansion of histories, timelines, and databases, and trying to make sure that we're actually on track with correct information in these areas. So I love to talk about this topic, be happy to talk about it in much greater detail. Please, happy to send you a copy of my article. Questions?
Hey, Jennifer, thank you. You're right on time, and we do have time for questions. We have a very tall man at the microphone, but he will make do.
There's only one tall man that you know. That would be Mr. Overton. How are you doing, Jen? Mark here.
Hey, Mark, how you doing?
Doing well. You didn't think I was going to let you off this easily. Someone had to. So just a quick question, given your passion for this, what do you see kind of as next in terms of what's got you really excited about what may be happening in this whole area? Just kind of your own personal take on it.
Well, my personal take is that it is a lot of very exciting stories evolving in many different directions. I think that more storytelling, more history will help to bridge between some of these different groups that are off in so many different directions. One of the things I would like to see happen is to go back and capture a lot of the history that was sort of, too concise, too condensed, and or maybe just not represented at all. I mean, some of the DARPA things that didn't get, presented at AMTA are amazing. Some of Kathleen Egan's work, I want to get Kathleen Egan giving presentations. But I'd like to capture those because people are retiring. John Wayne retired this, I'm sorry, not John Wayne, Charles Wayne retired this last year. Kathleen Egan retired. I mean, we need to capture the wealth of stories and learning that is kind of fading out of our community.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer, Steve LaRocca here. I have a question. Do you recall coming to West Point to get the department computer officer using Arabic Xerox word processing in about the year must have been 1985?
Yes, I do. I was so impressed. West Point was running these games where different groups had to work with, they had all their instructions and their clues in different foreign languages. And what a wonderful structure for motivation. Steve, I've always been so impressed by the types of things that you come up with.
You're very, very kind. Thank you. More questions?
Yeah, actually, I started, I started at Xerox in 1981 with one of the first computers, which was a multilingual computer. And the Palo Alto Research Center was already working on all kinds of things with MT. And I had come out of University of Texas at Austin that had what later became the Computational Linguistics Center. But, they had metal. And so, MT has been a major part of my life back to the days when it was only available on a mainframe.
And some of us do remember those days, ma'am.
You and me.
Both of us do. That's correct.
Well, I was trying to keep on time, so did I go too fast? I can go back and talk about some other types of things.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm looking at my watch. We've got just about a few seconds. I think we should have a short round of applause for our presenter here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nicely done, Jennifer. Thank you.